Andrew, Jeremiah, it's good to be back with you guys.
Here we go, episode 3.
Yeah.
Episode 2 of our semester. 3 of the podcast
Overall,
itself.
yeah.
But this will be lesson 2. How about
Exodus.
that? Episode 3, lesson 2.
Yeah,
that sounds right. Sure. Okay. We're talking about Exodus. Okay. So if you weren't with us last episode, we discussed the kingship of God in Genesis. A really good conversation. If you haven't listened to that, I encourage you to go back and listen to that first before you do our second installment here. We're going to be talking about the kingship of God in Exodus. This installment, I think we've got a lot to cover here. There's so much in Exodus for us to hit, but picking up kind of where we left off in our last episode, we were talking quite a bit about God in contradistinction, God in contrast to what the ancient world believed about the gods, the rest of the ancient Near East, what they believed about the gods. And one thing that came up, I think, when we were talking about Marduk, I had a quote in here from, there's an Assyriologist, Victoria Donnellan. I don't know if you've, or excuse me, no, not Victoria Donnellan, Nicole Birch. That's it. Yeah. Nicole Birch. She had an excerpt in here about Marduk, and I want to read this first just to set the stage for how not just the way that God is presented in contradistinction to the gods of the ancient Near East, but where the ancient world was starting. Like, assuming you had no relationship with God at all, you're not one of the people that begin to call upon the name of the Lord. A presentation in the ancient Babylonian gods. This is her work on that. She said this is in her piece on ancient Mesopotamian gods and goddesses. This is from 2019. She said, one of the best-known literary texts, Numa Elise, we talked about, from ancient Mesopotamia, describes Marduk's dramatic rise to power. In this narrative, the god Marduk battles the goddess Tiamat. I'm going to say that wrong. Tiamat. The deified ocean, often seen to represent a female principle, whereas Marduk stands for the male principle. Marduk is victorious, kills Tiamat, and creates the world from her body. In gratitude, the other gods then bestow 50 names upon Marduk and select him to be their head. Okay, so the only reason why I want to start there is picking up where we left off about the ancient world had this perception of a God who is elected, a God that's selected, a God that achieves his authority through conquest of other gods. And this was like very normal in the ancient world. This is ancient Greek myth. You see this in ancient Near Eastern texts, that the gods were often presented as in conflict either with one another or with man. That is not the relationship of God to man. Certainly not in Genesis, as we discussed, but also Exodus. In Exodus, that progressive revelation, that progressive push in Genesis from God in a general sense to the specific, to Abraham's family specifically, and then in the Exodus that reaffirmed and that reborn out. I want to pick up where we left off with that, so you guys feel free to jump back in where we left off from the last episode talking about those things.
Yeah. So there are a couple of things that I think are super interesting if we're talking about the ancient Near East as a whole, religions. Some of that's going to be impacted by location, time, right? Which period you're looking at, and what's super interesting. And I was just mentioning this to Andrew. Maybe it was today. I think maybe today. When you get to something like Hattusa in Anatolia, the Hittites, one thing that I found very interesting that, it's just an interesting factoid. Reading an essay from Gary Beckman, who is a scholar of Hittite, the Hittites. He talks about how when you look at religion in Hatti, you don't get a sense that there is a religion for kind of the people. There are texts that describe how the gods are kind of, they engage with the king. The king could be at fault for there being a famine in the land or something like
Mhm.
that, right? Because he did or he upset a god in some kind of way. But as far as like common people and their engagement with the divine, there seems to be some kind of absence there. Now, I don't want to make too much of that, but it's interesting to me because when you get to something like I mentioned in our last episode, right, Exodus 19, it is very clear that the Lord is wanting to establish with His people a relationship that's distinct from, you know, what they're used to, what they're accustomed to.
Mhm.
Um,
Can we
and
talk about too with like what think about in Exodus where the Israelites are coming out of?
Mm,
So there's a reason, obviously, of all the things that could have been written, that
yeah,
what's in the Bible is in there for a reason. Exodus, the Exodus is from Egypt,
yeah,
right? It's not in a vacuum. And so when it's from Egypt, you get the presentation in Exodus of what the Egyptians, yes, what the Egyptians believed about the gods, but more, maybe more importantly, or at least definitely like part of it, um, the Egyptians' relationship to Pharaoh and Pharaoh's relationship to the
Mhm.
gods. And um, I have like tons of notes about this, but you got like if we could like let's talk about that for just a second. The what the Egyptians believed specifically, who Pharaoh was to the Egyptians, and who Pharaoh was in the eyes in relationship to the gods. Again, the reason I think about this is like the name, even the name Ramses or Ra-Meses that you see in the Old Testament. This is son of Ra. There was a Jonathan Sachs pointed out, he was the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom for a while, and before he died, he pointed this out that Moses, the name Moses has a meaning in Hebrew, but he points out in an essay that he did on this in Exodus. He says it's important to remember that Pharaoh's daughter named Moses, and that name Moses in Egyptian Meses has a meaning as well. Rameses is son of Ra, Ramses, as we say, in our white people English. Son of Ra. Meses without the Ra is just son of. Who is his son? Son of, and that becomes important. That's an important part of Moses' life. Now in Hebrew, it means something else. And we know the Hebrew meaning of his name more popularly, but there's an Egyptian meaning of his name too. And that matters in my mind because when we talk about who the pharaohs were and we talk about the meanings of their names, often their names were in relationship to one or more of the gods. Um, what did the people believe about Pharaoh? What did Pharaoh believe about himself? And what do they believe about the gods? Like, I really want to talk about that because all of that sets the stage for, to your point, what happens in Exodus 19 and 20. Like, all of that, like, all of that is the background to, I am the Lord your God that brought you out of the land of Egypt. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. So,
yeah. So one of the texts, principal texts that come to mind for me would be something like Memphite theology, right?
yeah.
An Egyptian text that offers some description about the notion of where kingship comes from in the land there. So you have this conception that you have Horus as one god, I believe it is, and you have another god that occupies another portion of Egypt. You have the god of or the king of Upper Egypt and the king of Lower Egypt.
Which are reversed, by the way, for those that aren't unfamiliar
The
with
way the
ancient
Nile's
text.
flowing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so like Upper Egypt is southern Egypt
Yep.
and Lower Egypt is northern Egypt. So I know that sounds
Confusing
backwards, but
ancients.
yeah, those confusing ancients. But to Andrew's point, there's a good reason for it. The direction that the Nile flows is if you know.
Upriver, downriver.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, continue.
So yeah, like you've got that conception. Of course, there's the war between the two,
Mhm.
which is something I think that was a part of a theme that we were discussing in our last episode. But the triumph there of Horus, and some of the pharaohs had two names, right? They would have their more formal. I don't want to say liturgical, but they had their more formal name that was attached to Horus, or an additional name that was attached to Ra.
Yeah.
So there are, of course, there is a relationship there where the king was either in some way deified or descendant from,
Right.
right?
Andrew, doesn't that have you read I think it's Lewis Cummings' book on Alexander the Great?
Not that particular one. No.
He talks a little bit. I guess any book on Alexander that talks about his conquest of of Egypt would probably mention it, but his name was modified that way as well,
Yep.
right? You're a little bit more familiar with classics than me, but like,
Well, yeah, I think it's with ancient Egypt specifically, you have with what Jeremiah was going to with this idea of the connection of Pharaoh being the visible representation of a god,
the
because
vicar?
the vicar, the mouthpiece of Horus.
I thought you were going to say it.
I mean, in a way, it's not maybe that far off.
Yeah.
But the idea that you have an embodiment, because you have all these gods in Egyptian mythology, but you can only see one. And that is the Pharaoh, because there's this, in a way, this reincarnation aspect to Egyptian mythology where you have the green god, right? Osiris, or sometimes he's blue. He is the king of the underworld. He is the king of the afterlife, so to speak. When a Pharaoh dies, there's this, I don't know if transformation is the right word, but you have this change of when a Pharaoh dies, he becomes he becomes Osiris because he's dead. And Osiris is the king, the god of the underworld. The son of Osiris, the god of the underworld, his son is Horus. And so this is when the prince, as he becomes Pharaoh, he becomes Horus. So there's this mirror of what's happening in the natural world, the physical world. There's a mirror with the spiritual world, to where you have Osiris and his son Horus is mirrored in the death of the Pharaoh. And as he is buried by his son steps into the position as Horus.
You see this too with Ammon and Ra, is that you have Ammon, the less tangible, less visible. Ra is like Ammon revealed. And then you have Ramesses or Ramesses, son of the revealed. It's the same interplay. It exists.
That's important to, again, with what Jeremiah was saying, it's important why you have a birth name and then why you have a throne name.
Yeah.
Because your identity changes as you sit on the throne.
Yeah.
So I love talking with students, and I ask, well, do you know who Neb-Keperu-Ra is? That's just a fun word, right? Or fun name, Neb-Keperu-Ra. It's not common because we usually call him Tutankhamun.
Yeah.
But Tutankhamun, he has that name that his father gave him to associate with one god. But then as he takes the throne, he also has an additional name change of Neb-Keperu-Ra.
Is there any relationship to that in what you see in like later in medieval, in the reign of medieval kings, where they also assume a name change? Charles V, his name was not Charles. Popes as well. You see this with the papacy. Is that their names were like, when you look at like Gregory the 12th or whatever, his name was not Gregory. That he had a birth name, and then when they assumed the papacy, Pius the 12th, the same way. There's a book about him specifically, the Pope during the Holocaust and all that, and the name changes that happen. It's just it's one of those things where I'm assuming there's clearly a relationship somewhere. I'm probably ill prepared to identify it at the moment, but. One thing that does stand out to me about that a lot is this idea of men being gods or like the gods. Now that's like totally foreign to us because we live in Western society, North America, whatever. We think this goes back to what you said about Genesis, though. We have a conception of God that the ancient world didn't have, and we have it because of the Bible. Mm-hmm. So when you talk about we think of God, when we say God, people think of all powerful, omnipresent, omniscient. Like that's how we conceive of God. Even if this is to C.S. Lewis's claim, this was hilarious, but he I'm going to get the exact phrasing wrong, but the gist of it was, when I meet an atheist, my first question is, are you a Christian atheist or a Muslim atheist or what kind of atheist? Because even atheism has to be informed by a conception of what do you think when you say you don't believe in God? What do you mean by God? Mm-hmm. And so we think of all powerful. That's not how the ancient world saw it. And so when you read about Alexander the Great being deified, the pharaohs being deified, we think that's ridiculous. We're like, oh, that's lunacy. Like nobody would ever actually believe they're a god. Well, hold on. What do you mean by God? Yeah. Because if the gods were not all powerful, they could be opposed, they could be defeated, they could die. Yeah. It's not as inconceivable to say that men could become gods in their mind.
And if, as we were talking about the image of God from the last episode, if in specifically Egypt and Assyria, that you have only the kings are made in the image of God, that gives them special precedent to do certain things that no other humans can do because they are the image. And I know you can say some good things about this with kind of some comparisons here. But when you have a king of Egypt or a king of Ashur, you have these kings representing the gods to the people. Right. So they can say certain things and they are speaking for the gods at least at some capacity. Now in Egypt, I think it's a little, at least there are stronger ties between human deification versus some more in the East.
I still see a relationship with the Pope there. I'm sorry. Like I keep jumping back to that, but like the whole, I speak for God is and if you ask a Catholic today, I'm sure they would probably have because my understanding from listening to Catholics now is like, they believe in papal infallibility except when he's fallible. And it's like, well, I would need somebody to flesh that out. But it's kind of the same thing. Is that a papal bull is an issuance that is authoritative in a divine sense. So anyway, sorry.
Well, and the gods have given authority directly to these kings, so the king can make a law. Yeah. I think.
Wait, can't say that again. A king can or can't?
He can.
Yeah, a king can.
And he does. And you have to obey him because if you disobey the king, you are in fact disobeying the gods, and not even just the gods, but a God incarnate in at least in some ways. But this idea of specifically we're in Egypt, we're in the context of the Exodus, and you do have I like to describe the whole Bible really, that God has a great history of defeating false gods.
Yeah.
and I mean, because whether you go, you see that in Genesis 1, we're about to talk about this in the Exodus. We could talk about Mount Carmel. There's a lot more going on. We've all talked about, there's a lot more going on at Mount Carmel than just people, just fire coming down. Right. So there's a lot going on there, even death. Right. And then ultimately Satan. And so when you are looking at the Exodus, and then I'll stop here, but going back to that idea. Yeah, that's right. Going back to that idea of you worship Yahweh because of who he is and what he's done. He's about to show everybody who he is.
Right.
And he's about to show everybody, look at what he can do.
Yeah.
And I think that is such a powerful
New Testament principle as well, not just an Old.
Exactly. Yeah. Look at Jesus, his identity, what he's going to do on the cross. These ideas are laced through scripture.
Joel Hunt had an interesting bit about this. In one of the essays he wrote on this, he said, quote, "The first pages of the Pentateuch confront the reader with the beginnings of opposition to images representing deity. The order of creation and concept of the Imago Dei provide fodder for the polemic against the use of humanly fashioned objects to represent the presence of the deity. God fashioned humans in the image of God. Humans, in contrast, may not fashion God in the image of humans or anything else," end quote. And so
to break that down, he's contrasting to saying, really, you have God, Yahweh, the true God, making man in his own image. But in Egypt, you have humans making gods how they think the gods would have been.
Yeah. And so I remember reading that. He spends a lot of time specifically on like the image making part. Like, like polytheism, idolatry. Yes, that has a strong relationship with idolatry, but the image making part of it is kind of interesting. Is like, of all the ways that people could have conceived of another god or false gods, well, why image making? Like, you know what I mean? It's a fair question. It's like, well, why this physical image symbol? You get what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I don't want to over speak my knowledge here. But when we talk about technical term terracotta or clay used for images or specific kinds of images, when we think about those things in the ancient world, some of it depends for sure on which society, which period you're looking at, but also
even the concept of image making.
I think to an extent it depends on what's meant by images, right?
That's interesting.
So you might have a king who marches to Lebanon, or marches to the coast, across from Asher over to the coast. They might build or establish an image to themselves, just dedicating that
Yeah, it was.
event.
I remember reading Paul Cosman's book, Land of the Elephant Kings.
Yeah.
He talks about the Seleucid Empire. I think he's
Mhm.
Harvard. I don't remember what he does over there, but he wrote about idol making as a spatializing gesture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you might see some of that in, if I recall correctly, some of the kind of royal inscriptions to someone like Ashurnasirpal. I believe that's who it is. I could be getting that wrong from memory. But you'll see some of those things as he marches and he conquers, right? But you might also see it in temple uh, texts, right? So texts that describe the way that those were used and what they were used for. So there might be a little bit of variance in function, but I think to your points, right? The one of the emergence, and I think one of the reasons why those are used is because the idea of clay or the idea of fashioning something in the image, um, just that power to recreate, gave those people somewhat of a resemblance of the divine, right? If
So here's a question: how does that concept of image making in the pagan lands, like, how does that bring us to what happens at the mountain in Exodus when Moses goes up the mount to receive the law and the Israelites are image making? You know what I'm saying? Is like, is it
Well,
this is a learned behavior?
now
I think.
I would say let's start in Egypt before we even get to Sinai
Okay.
because I think that's a really good question, but I think we do have to contrast it with what Yahweh is going to do to the Egyptian gods because you have you have we talked about this briefly to preview it in the last discussion where God tells Moses, "You are going to know my name in a way that no one else has known my name."
Yeah.
Uh, Abraham could speak my name. He could speak Yahweh. We know that he built an altar and called upon the name of the Lord. We see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob doing that. But it's like God is saying they could say my name verbally,
But my
but they
record and fame. Yeah.
but they don't know all that my name can do. And there's going to be a relationship building here that is going to take place through this Exodus event. So that when Moses does go and starts confronting Pharaoh, and I'll just lay the groundwork and then let you guys run with it. But you have all of these gods of the pantheon that slowly through all of these different plagues are getting attacked.
Can you? Okay, I agree with you. Can you do some examples? Because I think that this is something that's come up. I've heard sermons where guys will preach about this, and I agree with the principle. I've also heard sermons where it's done wrong, where it's like, like just any god means anything that they want it to mean or whatever. Can you elaborate a little bit what you mean by that when you say that the plagues had a
I
relationship
think
with the
specifically
gods?
Exodus 12. 'Cause I remember somebody asked me one time, "Do you really think it was that God, the true God, was attacking Israel?" And I said, "Yes, of course," because Exodus 12:12, if I remember right, is the verse where it says that God executed judgment on the gods of Egypt and upon Pharaoh. And so now I don't, and you guys maybe can add to this. I don't think that there was necessarily one God for each and everything. Like there was only
absolutely not,
one
yeah.
God of, that represented the frogs. I think it's multifaceted because sometimes there's crossover
That's
with
the
what
pagan
a
world.
God,
That's,
right?
and
Exactly.
that goes back to like even the Marduk thing is like when you say Marduk, you don't mean one thing. When you say Marduk, you mean like maybe 50 different things.
Yeah. So I think that's where it gets too simplified at times. But when you have, the easiest one maybe to describe, and we can go deeper if we need to, but Ra being the sun god, and then there's darkness over all the land for 3 days. Is it 3 days? And it's so dark you can feel the darkness. It's not just dark. It's so deep of a darkness that one of the chief gods of their pantheon can do nothing about it. Yeah. And then the next step is, now that I've attacked all of these various gods, the gods of fertility that might be connected to the frogs and all these things, maybe all these naturalistic explanations about.
What about the Nile? Because the one thing that I've heard guys flesh out, and sometimes you're like, is this, I don't know, is this like just theological? Like what is the point of this? But the idea that the Nile turning to blood had more to do with what happened to the Israelites with the casting of the children into the river.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to that because I do think you see some of that in Revelation where one of the vials.
But the Nile was also worshipped.
Right. Well, that was going to be my second point is that you could, and I know scholars have called that the Nile is the life source of Egypt. If you don't have a Nile, you do not have Egypt. Yeah. So to attack at really the heart of the culture, and I think is a really big first step. And then eventually you progress through all these various fertility gods or goddesses, agriculture, all these things. Finally, you get to the only God, quote unquote, that the Egyptians can see. And as we were just talking about how you have the Pharaoh representing Horus, that powerful God, and then he would die and become Osiris. His son would become the next Horus. That attack on the firstborn out of all the land of Egypt, specifically the Pharaoh's son, is an attack on Horus himself. And then you have his son, who should be the next Horus. The Pharaoh can't even protect his own land. The Pharaoh cannot protect his own son, who's a god in waiting, so to speak. And so all of these attacks are directed to say there's only one true God.
Yeah, fact check true, by the way, Exodus 12:12. For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now, what's interesting about that is somebody could fairly ask the question, what's the point in God attacking a false God? Like this God has no real power. This God is not a real divine opposer. We're not dualists. We don't believe that there is divine opposition to God that is in any way equal or has the ability to resist him in a real way. These are false gods. So the question begs, when he says that he will execute judgment against the gods of Egypt, like, what do you guys think?
Well, one thing that I would consider too, because I don't think that the idea of the river being the life source, right? But also the response to what happened to the children of Israel. I don't think those are combative ideas, right? Because if it's the life source and conceived of as providing fertility in the land, I think it's possible to read, and I think some have to read the edict from Pharaoh that tells his people, hey, since the Hebrew midwives won't do it, you do it. Throw them in the river, right? Which is probably different from what he told the Hebrew midwives to do. He said, when they give birth, end it, right? So if that's the case, I think it's possible to view that as some form of sacrifice to the river.
Yeah,
Right?
I see what the two things go together.
Yeah.
But so are you done? I didn't want to
go for it.
But so to look at the issue of these false gods, let my people go that they may serve me. So going back to this issue of who you worship will determine how you worship. That whole Exodus event is about relationship, because as we're about to go to Sinai. Well, you even said it. I don't remember if it was the last discussion, but we're about getting to the linchpin, or one of the most significant portions of the entire Old Testament. So much so that it will mirror Acts 2, because the law is given on Mount Sinai. The law is given to the hearts of men on the day of Pentecost. This is a massive event, but it has to start with going through to know that this is the only God. This is the only God that you can have relationship. And this is what relationship looks like. Because if you get this wrong and you go to other gods, you're not going to have the same special place of relationship. So I think that's a critical piece, that it's not just let my people go. It's let my people go that they may serve me.
This is what I was getting to with the question about why execute judgment against the gods at all. It's not it's not for the God's sake.
Yeah.
He's executing judgment against the gods for the people's sake. So for the Israelites to see, for the Egyptians to see.
Yep.
And the question over which one of those was at play. Well, I think it's both. And the reason why I'm compelled to think of it this way is that, like, was it really necessary to completely destroy all of Egypt and do? Well, barring questions, but we can maybe talk another day about God's judgment and things of that nature. But one thing that is evident is that these were real in the eyes of the people.
Yeah.
And so it's not a theoretical response; it's a real response.
They believed it
to a real belief. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, people need dramatic examples to shake them out of apathy. So that was like part of it. And then I think about the coming out. it seems evident. Well, I guess we'll creep into it with Sinai, but it seems evident that, to your point about the let my people go that they may serve me, there's a little bit of Egypt in Israel, maybe a lot of it of Egypt in Israel
Yeah.
as they get closer to Sinai, and that had to be dealt with too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's good. One thing that I also think about too is both of you have touched on this, right? Pharaoh representing in some way the gods or the god of Egypt, the gods of Egypt. It's not just a judgment against an abstract concept that was not visible, right? But also Pharaoh's response to uh, Moses, Aaron, the Lord,
Mm.
as you're saying, let my people go. It's he's hardening his heart as the Lord is.
yeah, can we talk about this? Okay, this has come up in conversation with the reform types before, and I'll
All the time.
oh my gosh. First of all, they do rest the scriptures, as Peter said. But this comes up quite a bit is God hardened Pharaoh's heart. This is mentioned in Romans, and it's used as a proof text for there is no free will. There's an issue, though. There's a couple of issues with this. Number one being that you can't pull an anecdotal example like that of God's action to disprove sovereignty or free will, because there's an abundance of other scripture, but that's neither here nor there. We'll get to that when we do our series on reform. But the question of who hardened Pharaoh's heart, God does tell Moses, I will harden his heart. There's no doubt that that happens. But go back and read Exodus, because for every time that God hardened his heart, you can find, I could be wrong. I feel like the number was like 7. Like 7 times it says Pharaoh hardened his heart, or he hardened his heart. Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Pharaoh hardened. And it's like, well, hold on. There's an interplay between these two things, is that it is true that God's will was going to be accomplished. God is sovereign. This goes back to the last episode. You can't control God, nor can you conjure him.
Well,
which is a form of
kingship in
control.
Exodus, right? Even with
Kingship
human.
in Exodus, exactly right. And that matters because we're talking about Pharaoh, what the people believed about Pharaoh. Even Pharaoh didn't have sovereignty.
Yeah.
And so that's important for sure. But be careful when, like, if you present this as, God just, was controlling Pharaoh like a puppet. It's like, that's not exactly the way that this is presented. Jonathan, going back to Jonathan Sachs again, I remember a different essay, I think, but on the same subject matter. He talks about this relationship between what starts in bad decisions that are made, if I could say it like sovereignly, or bad decisions that are made independently, eventually turn into bad decisions that are made not independently, like in bondage. So like you see this with drug addicts, is like it starts with a free will decision. It ends with losing a little bit of your free will. Like, like what you think you're controlling today will control you tomorrow. What you give into today, tomorrow you'll be giving into it whether you want to or not. It's that same thing. Not to go down that rabbit hole too much, but my point being about when you're talking about kingship and his relationship to Pharaoh, you said it. So that's what made me think of it, was you said, look at Pharaoh, he hardened his heart. And it's like, that is absolutely in the text. Also in the text is God said, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. So I don't know if you guys want to talk about that at all.
Yeah, so there's I think something that's very, very interesting to me throughout these portions of dispute between Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh, but ultimately between Pharaoh and the Lord, right? Where Pharaoh is initially clearly rejecting the word of the Lord. There's a portion as well where Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh. I could not remember the exact location here. I think it's between chapters 8, 9, or 10. But there's a portion there where Moses and Aaron ask Pharaoh, "Hey, how long? Like, do you hope that this plague will stay? Like, the Lord is willing to take it away?" And he's like, "Yeah, let's have him take it away tomorrow."
Yeah, the plague of the frogs. I
Yeah.
only remember that because I remember Brother Andreasen from Norway preached a message at our church. I've never forgot. It was called "One More Night with the Frogs," and it was really good.
Yeah.
That's a good message. But yeah,
Which,
exactly right.
If you think about it, he has just in the text before that described it as being like it's a plague, right? It's a pestilence for his people. He wants it gone, and when Moses and Aaron are like, all right, when? He's like, tomorrow, right? Why not immediately?
Yeah.
I think there's still some of that that negotiation going on there, right? Well, let's extend this deadline because I said we're going to extend this deadline, right? I
Sure.
get that the Lord is in charge of this. He's in charge of this on my terms. Which, when we get to the idea of worship today, which I don't want to rush to contemporary examples too quickly, but when we get to the idea of worship today, a lot of times there are people who need deliverance from things, right? On their terms,
Yeah.
right? There are people who are in desperate need of some things on their terms. There are people who are praying that the Lord would take certain things from them on their terms. And when they don't see that in that way, and part of it, I think, is there's a phrase that we throw around, come with expectancy and expectation. You gotta have expectation. I think I understand what's meant when what that said, and I don't think we mean it negatively. But one thing that I've learned, especially working with younger students, is that expectation breeds entitlement.
Yeah. Yeah. If you,
Right.
yeah, that it's a wrong-headed
Mm.
approach of, yeah, like it's almost like an act of sovereignty. Like
Yeah.
when we say expectation, do we mean an expectation of God's will, God's way, or an expectation that my way will be met?
Yeah.
Yeah, and those are not the same thing at all.
Yeah.
They could be. Like they
Yeah.
you could be in alignment with God's word and God's way, and I hope that's the case. But you're right in the sense that oh man, we could definitely go down a rabbit trail here. But this comes out in Ezekiel.
Yeah.
When he's warning when he's talking about prophets, specifically, he's talking about the issues that come up with false prophets.
Okay.
And most often the issue with false prophets is that attitude of it's almost like a what do we call an echo chamber, where what do they promise the people, what do they speak to the people, what the people already desired in the first place. Their attitude of expectation from God is in reality it's carnality that has been shrouded in a spiritual phrase,
Which,
yeah,
and I don't know that we.
which has nothing to do with Exodus. But
Well, I mean, no, it really
no, it
does, because
does.
the hardness of the heart.
yeah, no,
I mean,
with Pharaoh, exactly.
such
Yeah.
a human condition that whether you're a Pharaoh or
Yes.
who else faces the judgment of the firstborn,
Yeah.
down to the lowest person in the kingdom.
Yeah. And here's what I think also relates to because they're going to go through a wilderness. They might have been praying for deliverance from that bondage, but halfway through it, it's like, this is not the kind of deliverance that we expected. Take us back to Egypt. At least we could eat this, or at least, right? We didn't have to depend on the Lord for tomorrow. When we were in Egypt, we knew Pharaoh was
Now
going
that
to,
we have to depend on him, we're not so sure that we like that come with expectation.
Yeah.
It's like, well, expectation may not mean what you think it means.
Yeah,
So,
which interestingly enough, they could expect that the Lord was going to show up
Mhm.
and provide, because he was a pillar of cloud, fire. But also they were going to see manna at appointed times, right? They
Yeah.
could expect to see manna at appointed times
Mm.
because the Lord was going to show up. We can expect the Lord to show up, right? What we can't do is expect to conjure or control.
Yeah.
That's the fine
Which
line right there.
I know, I know where you're leading this. Let me make just a couple comments on the hardness of the heart quickly, so it doesn't get irrelevant. But I would say, first of all, just because your heart is hardened, that doesn't mean you're damned. That doesn't mean you've lost your
I agree.
salvation.
Oh yeah, trust me,
Because
that reform, that's the
Mark
worst, man.
6,
I hate it so much.
I still remember reading Mark 6 when it says that the disciples' hearts were hardened at some things that Jesus had said. And I'm like, wait a second. So they're hardened, and 11 of them are going to get the Holy Ghost.
Yeah, they take that scripture about Pharaoh and they say he was chosen for damnation.
Yeah.
Like that is
Hardness
so
of the heart does not mean you're damned.
Yeah.
But then the other big thing that really has hit me in studying through Exodus, before any of the hardening actually happens, what's the first thing that Pharaoh says in Exodus 5? Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, "Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go that they may hold a feast unto me in the wilderness." And Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord?"
Yeah.
So right off the bat, he is revealing what his intentions, what his heart is. And I think the moral of the story, so to speak, is that God will give you what you want. If you want to reject him, he'll amplify it.
Yes, that's exactly right.
You can almost hear, who is he to tell me what to do?
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. Exactly right. And that's the thing about it goes back to that. You know, I hate to use the word cliche because a lot of cliches become cliche because they're at one point they were true, or at least they were accepted to be true. But that, thank God for unanswered prayers. It kind of
Mm.
goes the other way too. Is people get frustrated when they ask God for things in prayer and it doesn't happen, and so they take silence as I didn't do the incantation just right.
Mm.
Like, oh, what I wanted to happen didn't happen. Therefore, I got the formula wrong. It's like, well, hold on.
Yeah.
Wow.
Like God is sovereign, and it is very possible that you're asking for something that's going to destroy you.
Yeah.
And that includes miracles. And I know people don't want to hear that, but there
Yeah.
are Jesus didn't heal everybody. You know,
Yeah.
Jesus didn't touch everybody. There were some people he did, and we're thankful for that, and we believe that he can. And we're encouraged to have faith, and all of these things
Yeah.
are true. But you've got to balance that with God's sovereignty a little bit.
I think there's a both an apologetic and pastoral element that we are touching on here, right? Because you have maybe through terrible name it, claim it, blab it,
Yeah.
grab it kind of views where the focus is if you have enough faith,
Anything you can have it all.
that
Yeah.
faith becomes a talisman,
Yep.
right? It becomes this image where you can harness the power of the deity,
Yep.
and that deity has to do whatever you want
Mhm.
because you control it with your faith, right? You're depositing tokens where it's a transaction.
Yeah, and that's in Egypt. You know that like a lot of the beliefs about the gods served a transactional function. Um, we talked about it in the last episode. This comes out in Job.
Mm.
I think it's the poem of the righteous sufferer that, or maybe it's Babylonian theology. I don't know which one it is, but there's a conversation between two men, and they're just simply discussing why bad things happen, and the correct answer. And in almost every case, the answer is offer propitiation to the gods, and everything will be solved. All of your problems will be solved. That if something bad is happening in your life, it's because you've done bad things. If good things are happening, it's because you've done good things. And the way to get out of bad things is to transactionally go through a certain process. And the interesting thing is that you do see sacrifice in the Old Testament, but it's never transactional. In fact, it's the opposite of transactional because
If it's done right.
Yes, because you do see sacrifice that is accepted. You see
Yeah.
sacrifice that is rejected.
Yeah.
And when you talk about the rejected, this is the issue for me when we talk about this with like the modern church, is that I don't ever want to be accused of somebody who is resistant to the idea of sacrifice, of giving, of praise, of faith. All of that is valuable and true. The issue is when it becomes transactional, when it's God is contractually obligated to do what I've asked, or because I've said it with my mouth, that it is guaranteed to happen. It's like, well, no. You see that number one, we talked about it last week with the Old Testament with the ark, because their hearts were far from God. It didn't matter what they were proclaiming with their mouths if their heart was far from him. Not my words, that comes from the Bible too. But the issue being that you have an attitude that God owes it to me to do what I desire him to do, provided I fulfill certain obligations. And we've made those obligations, to your point, it's mostly like proclaiming faith or something to that effect. And that is much more of a pagan idea than it is a biblical idea. As the biblical idea is much more nuanced than that. The biblical idea is draw near to me and I'll draw near to you, that God's provision is conditional. And I know people don't want to believe that, and they have an attitude that's completely contrary to that, especially with Andy Stanley, we talked about in the introduction episode. People don't want to believe that God's blessings in his favor, they are conditional on the character and the heart of their people toward their God, not toward what he does, but toward their God. And it's much more complicated. And to say nothing of all the examples we can offer in scripture of righteous people who did righteous things and not only didn't receive miracles, but sometimes were made to endure unbelievable hardships.
Yeah.
And
you can still trust him.
Yeah.
Because and
Job.
we love Job because he gets everything back. But I love bringing up Naboth because the guy got murdered and his sons get
Yeah.
murdered. And it looks like, I mean, we don't know.
No name it, claim it preacher can
Yeah.
preach about Naboth because it's
yeah, right.
righteousness that doesn't come with reward.
Because we don't,
Well, no earthly reward,
it
anyway.
looks like he's righteous because it looks like he's holding on to his inheritance tied back to Mosaic law. So, I mean, there's enough there to me that it looks like he's a pretty good guy.
At least better than Ahab.
What, yeah. but what is crazy is then if you do a study from, is that 1 Kings 21, I think, where he dies, somewhere close to that. If you do a study between 1 Kings 20 going forward to 2 Kings 10, see how many times how many times his name comes up, because God never turns a blind eye to evil. He will. So my point is that because the story goes is that God is going to execute judgment on the house of Ahab and Jezebel because of the various sin, but also because Naboth keeps coming up, and Ahab is going to die in the same area that Naboth's vineyard was in, and same thing with Jezebel. So I guess my point in connecting with what you guys were just saying is that there's a lot more to this life than what's physical. Because there's a spiritual element that's going on that we can be blessed and cursed, not just in the physical, but in the spiritual as well. And so when we're just naming it and claiming it and just, this life is all peace and prosperity and health and all that kind of stuff, there's a lot more to living for the Lord than just that.
Yeah.
And we need to learn how to suffer well, not to get too far afield from Exodus. But I think the point still remains that God is still God, whether you are an Egyptian. He's still the king, whether you are an Israelite. Right. We are going to see Egyptians leave with Israel. And
I was going to ask it that. I was getting to that with the
and that may not be a positive. It may not be a good thing for the Israelites later on.
The mixed multitude.
The mixed multitude.
I was going to ask about that, and and this is the last thing I'll say about we did go down a little bit of a rabbit trail, but it's totally fine. To say all of that is to say nothing of the fact that riches and health are no evidence of God's provision in your life.
Neither is lack thereof.
Yeah.
Right.
Now it might be God's mercy.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. But the idea that riches and health are some kind of definite indicator of supernatural blessing is foolish. I mean, the Old Testament's full of, and David wondered at that. Why did the wicked prosper?
The Hebrews are in slavery. Because it's God's will.
Yeah, the Hebrews are in slavery because it's God's will. That's a hard pill to swallow.
And they got there because Joseph was faithful.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, mixed multitude. I was going to ask.
Well, no,
that was kind of the next step to some of this.
Well, and I'm going to kind of tie a couple things together because going, Stephen, back to what you asked a little bit with why do this major thing in Egypt? Well, yes, it is about Israel coming out, but you have Genesis 15 where God tells Abram, there's still some Amorites that I'm going to give 400 years for them to repent. Yeah. And then by the time God does all of his stuff in Egypt, and they get 40 years later, they get to the promised land, you're at least going to have a Rahab say, we know about your God. This is not ignorance. This is not something like, we don't know who Yahweh is. We know who you are. We know who you are as the people of God. We know who Yahweh is, and we're terrified. And so I know that that mixed multitude is going to get Israel into trouble later. But I think the point, at least maybe we could say the heart of God is, if there are some Egyptians that would turn, that would be a positive thing.
Well, and with the mixed
because you have Canaanites that turn.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, to think about your point of Genesis 15 in Exodus 33:2, verse 1 and verse 2, right? The text says, the Lord said to Moses, depart, go up hence, thou and the people which thou hast brought up out of the land of Egypt, unto the land which I swear unto Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, saying, unto thy seed will I give it, and I will send an angel before thee, and I will drive out the Canaanites, the Canaanite, the Amorite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Right. So the Lord gave space there. I know that there's that talk about, especially with the dying or dead now new atheists, right, where the Lord is this God who commands genocide, yeah, right. And then you've got those responses from people like Paul Copan, right? Is God a moral monster? Well, he's given this space, this room where he has encouraged those people. They know they have received.
It's not ignorance.
Yeah. So they're not occupying the land without warning that you either change or be removed,
Right.
right? Because it's not just simply that there's migration that's happening in these texts. If God is the creator of all things, then all things belong to him.
Mhm.
So he can call the people his own, call them by his name, and have a land that's his,
Yeah.
that he can dedicate to those people.
The moral monster thing has always made me laugh too, because I think about our world today, and it's like, if what happened on October 7th in Israel would have happened here, we would have dropped Moabs on like whoever, like it would have been over, like people we don't have any problem with executing judgment on immorality ourselves. But the moment we talk about God executing judgment on immorality, we're like, hold on just a second. And it's like, well, guys, we do the same thing and we sleep just fine at night because we understand that there is a moral center to this. Like if what happened on October 7th in Israel happened here, nobody would have gotten mad if we dropped a Moab on Gaza. It's only because it happened outside the context of here that we're like, well.
Well, to your point, right, and to what we've been talking about, especially that underlying point, right? Just because you do not see some of those benefits from God, those things we call blessings, right? Those does not mean that He is absent from your life, or even that you are failing in your life. To what you were talking about with Job, right? Just because those things are not happening does not mean that you are failing or not failing, right? God can use those things to demonstrate what it looks like to serve Him, despite.
And you do get the impression from Job that motive matters. With I remember writing this in that paper I was talking about. I think it's the last episode about Job's kind of interesting character, because most people, when they read the introduction to Job and it says that he offered sacrifices for his children on behalf of his children, because who knows what if perhaps they had sinned or something, or for their protection. And most people get the impression from reading the book that Job offers sacrifices to God for all the good that's in his life. That's the mistake that Satan makes when he comes before the Lord. But you don't get the impression from reading Job that he offers sacrifices to God for all the blessing that's in his life. You get the impression that he offers sacrifice to God for all the evil that's not in his life. And there's a big difference. And it's that second one that Job had to get under the learning tree a little bit with God. And it does happen by the end of it. You see that, of course, with Elihu's rebuke and Job's response. And then ultimately Job praying for the very people that judge him and all this stuff. But that's a lesson that would be valuable for a lot of people who have, especially in the name it, claim it movement, is that their attitude, they justify themselves saying, we don't just worship God for all the good that's in our life. And I think you're probably being sincere, but that there's a second layer to that is like, but also seeking His favor and His hand for all the evil that's not in your life is just as bad. And a practice of the pagans. And if you guys have any other thoughts to add to that,
let's get to Sinai.
Exodus. Yeah, Sinai was kind of.
I think Sinai is a good place to.
Yeah.
Take it away. I've got my thoughts here, but you guys take that away first.
Well, I mean, they get through the Red Sea.
Yeah.
They're not going to see, from this day forward, they're not going to see the Egyptians. God's not going to take them up by the way of the Philistines. He's going to take them the slower route because He's got, as you were saying, Stephen, I think that He's got some Egypt to still mold out of them. And they're going to have to trust their way through.
Despite what the Apostolic Study Bible says, they did not go the way of the Philistines. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that in
well,
there.
they actually cross a Red Sea, right? It's not the Reed Sea.
Well, that is what the Bible says. They crossed the Red Sea, and we can have a healthy discussion. But suffice it to say, I do not believe that there was a travel across a puddle,
right,
up in the north.
No, they crossed the Red Sea.
Yeah,
and God provides for them and gets them down to Sinai, where if I don't have the chronology in front of me, but I mean, they're at Sinai for over a year, if I remember right, or close to it, maybe 11 months. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but they're at Sinai for a long time. And Moses, I think oftentimes we have this idea of Moses going up once and coming down with the 10 Commandments. He goes up and down numerous times from when they arrive in Sinai to the building of the tabernacle. He goes up and verbally gets the 10 Commandments, comes down and shares them with the people. Because I had a student ask me, if the people didn't know the 10 Commandments, why would God judge them for building the calf? The problem, though, is that even before they had the stone 10 Commandments, they had them verbally. He told the people, this is what God is commanding. I'm setting this before you. What do you say? Exodus 19, they all agree. So then he goes back to the mountain and he, like I said, he comes down several times, but it's not until he goes up and is there for an extended period of time that he gets the stone tablets written with the finger of God.
Yeah. Before I have some thoughts about the golden calf incident and all that we're talking about, but before I go to that, what are your guys' thoughts about, I had a spirited debate one time with an apostolic pastor about this, about the nature of God's commandments before Sinai. Going back to that, why would God judge them? You do see that giving there, but there's something else that I think people might miss, and I'm terribly curious what you guys think about this. There is some evidence through Genesis that the people of God, the children of Abraham, they had however you want to frame it, they had an understanding of what pleased God and what didn't please God well before it was ever given to Sinai. You think about Joseph running from Potiphar's wife. Why? Well, because thou shalt not commit adultery is in the heart of God. Even finer stuff, like you see this with Judas. Is it Judas' sons in Genesis, where his first son dies, the brother takes the wife, he also dies. That's levirate marriage. Like, we just read right past it. Like, how did they know to take the brother that died? His brother takes care of the wife. Yeah, that's Old Testament too. Now that, of course, it's given in the commandments later. My point being is that all of the moral commands, to say nothing of the clean and the unclean animals of Noah, you see that as well. But my point being is that this idea that mankind had no conception of what pleased God and what God loved and what God hated before Mount Sinai is, of course, ridiculous, because the book of Genesis has judgment in it too. Even something as simple as Abraham with his wife in the presence of Abimelech, thou art a dead man.
Yeah, he had a dream.
Well, what is the judgment before Mount Sinai? You get what I'm saying? So it's no argument. That's all. The only point I'm trying to make is it's no argument to say that they had no conception of God's justice, God's law, if you want to say it that way.
I think that's a good point, because when you look at the chronology of Genesis, I think because the Bible presents these topically, we do not get a good sense that when you have Adam to Noah, it's only a few generations. Like Noah's father would have known Adam.
Right.
Then when you get to the Tower of Babel, Shem, now we don't know if they met, but Shem is still, or actually,
it's Melchizedek.
Yeah. But Noah would have been alive probably at the time of the Tower of Babel, and Shem would definitely have been alive at the same time as Abram. Now, again, we don't know if they would have met, but these generations are very close together. And if at the Tower of Babel, although that is unity in rebellion, okay, I have heard sermons preach about how we should be more like the people of Babel because they were unified. There's a type of unity that we should not be aspiring to, and that's rebellion.
You hear that preached. I was like, nothing could stop them. They could do anything because they had unity. It's like, but that's not them. What?
Well, God stopped them.
God stopped them. Yeah, I was going to say, it's like, and, that's maybe not the best.
God had to come down to see their accomplishment.
Just a word of advice to preachers out there who are really trying to drive home the power of unity. Let's go to they were all in one mind and one accord or something like that. I don't know. Literally anywhere but the Tower of Babel.
Which, to that point, right, you have the dispersion of people and the invention, or maybe not invention, but like the division of tongues. Whereas they were all in one mind and one accord.
It's back to how it should have been.
Yeah, it's restoration there, because you have men out of, from all over there in Judea.
It's a reversal of Babel.
Yeah.
But I think, those issues of the generations make it seem to me, at least, that you can have teaching that goes down.
And what is that teaching? This is what people miss, is when you say this isn't Adam's teaching. This isn't good moral thoughts for your life. Where did the teaching come from? How did Cain and Abel know how did Abel's offering sacrifices?
Yeah.
We just take it for granted. It's just in the text. But I'm like, well, you learn that somewhere.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit about this when we were talking about sacrifice, right? There are some sacrifices that are acceptable and some that are unacceptable. And this is why ultimately when we get to that place in Hebrews 11, those people who suffered and endured, that kicks off with Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice than Cain.
Right.
So
anyway, that was my own rabbit trail, food for thought. Sinai.
Mount Sinai.
I wanted to get your guys' thoughts on this because I shared this with Jeremiah. I was reading this. Exodus chapter 20, verse 1, God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. So this is an argument. This is not for me. The first place I read this was Rabbi Joseph Telushkin had made this comment about what historically the Jews have taught about these commands. He talks about thou shalt not make unto me, when he gets to I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not make any other graven image. This specific passage, let me get the footnote pulled up here. Tushkin said the reason for this debate about what actually constitutes the first commandment, because most of us start it with thou shalt have no other gods before me. He makes the point, and it's a subtle point. It doesn't really disrupt anything in the text, but he does make the point, and we got our resident Hebrew scholar here to help us with this. He said the reason for the debate about what constitutes the first commandment largely centers around a linguistic question. I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, but aseret ha-dibrot is the Hebrew phrase for what Christians call the Ten Commandments. However, this phrase rightly rendered in Hebrew is actually the 10 statements. Were the introductory injunctions of Exodus chapter 20 meant to be called the 10 Commandments, it ought to have been rendered aseret ha-mitzvot instead. Because of this, many Jewish scholars have suggested that acknowledgement of the Lord's place as sovereign God and deliverer of his people is the first of the 10 statements. On the surface, this would seem to suggest that there are not 10 but 11 commandments. However, the second and third commandments, have no other gods and make no graven images, are combined in this arrangement, reducing the number once again to 10. So it's still 10, but they start the 10 in a different place. And there is no consensus on this. So this is not like, this is what the Orthodox Jews, there's no consensus on it. It's just a point that he makes about, there's a healthy debate over, is Exodus 20 and 1 meant to be is it a prerequisite to all that follows in a material way? I am the Lord your God that brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt. Yes. Is that prerequisite understanding necessary to all that follows? And some of that's what we're talking about with the kingship of God in Exodus. What did the Jews believe about who God was to them personally? What we believe about who God is in the world. You guys just give me your thoughts on that. I don't know. Yeah. And I want to know your thoughts about the aseret ha-dibrot versus mitzvot. Dibrot versus mitzvot.
Can I see the way he's transliterated it?
Sure.
And is he pulling this from verse 1?
I think it's from 20 and 1. There's the 10 statements, and this is how he has it, 10 commandments.
I'm not seeing.
And by the way, he doesn't. I don't want to misrepresent his views. He does not say that he cedes to one of these or the other. He just says, in our tradition, this has come up before. So
I don't see those that phrase in the Hebrew verse 1, or verse 2 either. So I'm not quite sure where.
No, sorry. No. It's the phrase, the 10 commandments versus the 10 statements, which of course neither of those phrases appear. Yeah. It's the summary. It's the summary of it.
What should they be titled?
What should they be titled? And it centers around the 20 and 1 question. And by the way, everything that I read, these are my footnotes on my paper from this. His exact quote you can find in Biblical Literacy. It's on pages 421 and 422 is where he actually talks about it. These are just my.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing that I would say is, so you have some of that too when you say Decalogue, right? The Decalogue is Greek, the 10 words, right?
That's interesting, yeah.
So you have some of that there. The question is like, what are the 10 statements, right? If that's the case, where does that begin?
They're all commandments except that first one, thou shalt have no other gods before. Well, okay, I'm going to say they are. I mean, maybe
you're asking like, where should it
maybe the remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. It's a commandment. It's also, it's a little qualitatively, there's no thou shalt or thou shalt not. It's still a command, but it's framed in a different way.
And you have different types of law in this time in biblical text, right? Without getting too technical, there are some laws that are conditioned upon setting, right? And then some that are absolute and always to be observed. So where I would kind of respond to the sayings, if we are looking at this as just sayings, of course, after verse 1, the sayings start with verse 2,
Yeah,
right? He
exactly.
starts by saying, I am the Lord, right? If we look at this as what the intention of these sayings are, it's, I think, preservation of that first statement.
I agree. Yeah,
So-
that's kind of the way that I frame it in my head. Yeah.
And so you have, I think, 10 laws or 10 commands to preserve that first statement.
They govern. It's almost like the governing principle.
Yeah.
And I think that that's kind of what. Yeah, because if you get that wrong, you get everything else wrong.
Well, because why should they do these things?
Exactly. Yeah.
Because he is Yahweh.
So it is a necessary
the God that brought
prerequisite.
you.
Like that's kind of the interesting thing about it is why start that way, and then you think about like, well, what everything that follows, and it's it makes
Now this
sense.
is sort of common today. If you pick up a commentary or a specialized work on Exodus 20, they're going to be compared to suzerain treaties.
Mhm.
In that day, Michael Coogan has a book on like a short history of the Ten Commandments, and at the end of it, he has a translation of a treaty between Mursili II, king of Hatti versus or two, the king of Amaru, right? And traditionally, it's understood that this is a prologue or an introduction that demonstrates why his name can be trusted.
Well, pause there because I think this is a really crucial point. But a suzerain treaty, the significance of that is that you have a high king, and then you have his servants, so to speak, or his vassals.
Yeah.
So you pledge your allegiance to the high king.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the wording, and I know you're going there, but the wording, I will be your God and you will be my people. That's kingship language.
Yeah.
The vassals are pledging their allegiance, and that high king will protect and be the king, the power over the people. So, I mean, that's a suzerain treaty in a very concise way, maybe. But I think I want to lay that foundation because I want you to keep going with what you're just saying.
Yeah. To that end, there's something important about the name that's attached, right? We talked about this in Genesis, right? The name. At the end of our last episode, we talked about that weight, that fame that comes with the name, right? His glory. It's important. It's something that's heavy. And I'm translating that word glory there intentionally. It's heavy. It's weighty. It's a weighty thing. It's not something that's light or simple, which we probably will get into this at some point when we talk about the kings in a few episodes from now or next episode. I don't remember where that falls, but we will talk about, I think we'll have to, Jehoshaphat and Ahab. I think talked with both of you about that, where Ahab is described. You have two kings that the kings of Judah and Israel are compared to, David, and you have Jeroboam. And Jeroboam, he caused Israel to sin a certain sin. And Ahab, when he emerges, he's more evil than anyone before him. And it says as if the sin of Jeroboam were a light thing.
Right.
Right? If you mishandle the glory or the fame, the name of the Lord, that's not a light thing. That's not something that should be taken lightly.
And that gets to the Lotissa commandment. Yeah, that's the thou shalt have no other gods before me.
Yeah.
And then
not take his name
then do
in
not
vain.
take his name. They're connected.
Because it's not just verbal.
Yeah, do not take his name in vain. Does not. We're not talking about like cussing. That's dealt with in other passages, so we don't endorse that.
Right.
But that's not what it's taught in this particular. Is to don't carry the name of the carry commandment. Don't carry the name of the Lord with vain purpose. Yeah.
Because if his name, if his name is tied to relationship, and we are, or Israel, being people of the name, you have to do what the name commands you.
Yeah.
And if the name of God is called over them, like we were talking from Genesis, that they can call upon the name of the Lord, but that also can be seen as God's name called over them. Mm-hmm. So they are underneath the name. So all of this connects to that suzerain treaty that you have the high king. And if his name is over you, he owns you. And I love at the end, so we get to the end of chapter 20, and he starts, all those commands are listed. He starts giving further commands on different aspects. Let's see, I just lost it here. Okay. Getting around 24, 25. He says, in all the places where I record my name, I will come unto thee and I will bless thee. Because the name is tied to the relationship, and that is tied to his presence.
Yeah. Right.
So this is why eventually, and I'll just end with this part, that, where you have the tabernacle, And then eventually Moses is going to say in Deuteronomy, God is going to choose a place to put his name.
Right.
And then in 1 Kings 8, what do you have? Around 60 references to Deuteronomy. And you have all of these issues of God's name is here, because where his name is, that's where he is.
Yeah.
And of course, baptism, there's a lot of connections there. But Mount Sinai is so critical, I think, for this issue of God's presence and his name.
And here's what's super important, and I'm sure we'll get to this when we get to the New Testament at some point. And I know that we've mentioned, you mentioned, Andrew, Acts 2 in connection with Sinai, right? It's at Sinai where they move from just being a people, right? You mentioned they were the family of Abraham, right? They become the family of Israel, right? The sons of Jacob, or the sons of Israel. Then from there in Egypt, they become the people, right? They're a mass group because they're growing very quickly. And it's not until Sinai where they move from just being a family to a people. Now they're the nation of Israel,
Right.
because they have bylaws,
Right.
right? And they've got a name.
Yeah.
And in the ancient world, what you will see is you have the god Asher and his city, right? You have those patron deities where they were connected to those cities. Marduk, his kingship, his rule was in Babylonia. So,
And you see that in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
It's like the establishment of the temple in Jerusalem.
But that's a place where he's going to draw people to him.
Right.
It's that place of access, whereas it's not competing city states against each other.
Right.
And what's interesting too is it's like he's going to draw people to him, which is distinct from something like the Assyrians, where you had mass deportations.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's
and things
interesting.
like that, right? There's some distinctions there. So
I wanted to ask about as we somewhat come to a close here with this episode. Okay, so the episode of the golden calf. There's a lot of discussion that comes up about this a lot with were they worshiping a god of Egypt? Was this a form of Baal, or was something else happening here? Hunt makes a good observation on this. Obviously, it's in the text as well, but it comes up in that quote when he says that God made man in his own image. Man was not free to make God in his own image. He's not talking about the image of flesh and bone like a human being, but in his talks about icons and making idols, he brings up the quote from Aaron that Aaron announced that the celebration at the bottom of the mountain would be called a feast of the Lord. And that is in Exodus, is that 32 and 5? Exodus 32 and 5, that he calls. So to just set the background here, Moses goes up the mountain. They're getting tired of waiting, however you want to frame it. They're at the bottom of the mountain. They say, Aaron, make us, gods that we may worship. And Aaron says, this is the God that brought you out of Egypt.
Yeah, he said, verse 4 and 5, these be thy gods, O Israel.
These be thy gods, O Israel. That's okay. That's
out
important
of the
too.
land of Egypt. But he does say that tomorrow is a feast unto the Lord, Yahweh.
Feast unto the Lord. Yeah. Okay.
I don't mean to interrupt. This is just for our listeners, some pastor. I wonder the way the word tomorrow is used throughout the text, because we talked earlier
About
on
Pharaoh. Yeah. Tomorrow.
That's interesting. Just a small point
Tomorrow.
to say.
And then they rise up and play. And that is interesting. Good thought there. That question about the feast of the Lord, is it okay? So this is where my mind immediately goes, is going back to the getting Egypt out of Israel. Whether I do believe that they conceived in their mind that this idol, this was a physical representation of the God that brought them out of Israel. I also believe that there was that, you could call it syncretism or associative principle. When he says, these be thy gods, I get the impression from reading it that what you're taking away from that is that they had sort of put God on the same level, or they had put him in the pantheon, if I can say it that way. They had kind of associated him with the powers they were familiar with, which comes principally from Egypt. And so you guys give me your thoughts on that. I do believe that this was an idol, an icon of, however you want to frame it, that this was intended to be in devotion to the God that brought them out, but it was their conception of the God that brought them out. And it obviously became sin. And of course it's a violation of the don't make any graven images. So.
Go ahead.
So I'm going to say everything you said was wrong. No, I'm just kidding.
That is not surprising at all.
No. So uh, I'll recall a conversation I had in interest. I'd say fun conversation I had with a professor of mine, where he had asked me how familiar I was with kind of golden calves and things like that in the ancient world. So one of the things that he had pointed out to me was a lot of times they were in some sense divine steeds.
Steeds?
Yeah,
like a horse?
Like a horse.
Okay.
Yeah, they were in some sense the things that carried the gods, right? And you have Israel wandering in the wilderness, maybe wandering with an O, where this Moses has been, right? Because the response is to the absence of Moses, like, hey,
Right.
we don't know where he's run off to, or this God that he's serving. I think about their response to the Ten Commandments, going back to Sinai. I am the Lord, your God, and their response is they hide, they move far away from because they're
don't
scared.
speak to us, Moses. Talk to us for him because
Moses,
he's
stand between, right? Where's God? Well, they've already kind of have hidden their face from him, because just before that in chapter 19, the Lord tells Moses what to do, prepare them to approach his presence. Right? You have Cain, going back to chapter 4 of Genesis, who leaves the presence of God. He turns his face away from the presence of God. And you have some of that similar thing represented here in Exodus 20. And I'm curious if their conception there, or if their thought process was, to your point, syncretism, right? They're conceiving of the God or of the Lord in the way that others conceived of their gods. He is with us because we have his
right.
His ride.
We have the
right?
yes.
We
yeah.
have his.
We have the image. We have that this represents his movement.
Or Pharaoh.
Yeah.
Or Pharaoh.
And now Moses is gone. He's not a pharaonic figure.
Yeah.
That's what I was wondering too, is about the Pharaoh part of it, is that maybe one step removed. Yes, it's a feast to the Lord, but it's a feast to the Lord and the gods that brought us out. Is that a reference to Moses? And that Moses is God's action,
That's interesting.
and seeing that relationship between Pharaoh and the gods, and they conceive of Moses as their Pharaoh and God as their God, but all of it's wrong.
Yeah, that's
I don't know, but I do get the impression, of course, and that none of that takes away from the fact, of course, that it's a violation of the commandment. Yeah.
Which here's the question: how can you have a feast proper, right? Like a feast in the way that it should be, based on that God's determination, right? If you've turned your back to him, or if you've hidden your face from him, which is why.
Yeah, and when the judgment is curious too. Like the judgment that comes after it's not like what happens with Korah, for example.
Yeah.
Like the judgment is odd. It's the melting down, the drinking, and Aaron isn't condemned. Like he's done something wrong. There's no doubt about it. But when I say condemned, I mean he's not killed. Like it's different. Like there's something qualitatively different about this story. That why is Aaron remains in his proper place after this, despite whatever he did that was wrong. And that's something in my mind, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Well, and that whole scenario is fascinating, because I'm reminded of, it'd be appropriate to bring up his name, but one of Brother Kilman's messages, Brother Kilman taught all three of us one of his messages when I was a student about broken tablets and torn Bibles.
Yeah.
And he preaches from this text where Moses comes down and he breaks those stone tablets. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard preachers reference Moses' anger and how bad that was, when in reality, or at least I think Brother Kilman makes a very proper case here, is that Moses was very justified in what he did, because he's showing the people what you guys have done in the physical. Here's what it looks like. And he smashes the 10 commandments.
Yeah.
You have
broken covenant.
You
Right.
have, between your high king and you are supposed to be his vassals, you have broken what has been established that you agreed to in chapter 19.
God didn't break it. They did.
And I think for anyone listening that wants to dive deeper, maybe I think the technical term is prophetic gesture, right? Because you see that in Hosea, where he marries.
It's a real live illustration.
We talked about this in class today.
Good preachers have illustrations, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
and maybe just I'll maybe just end my comments here with the people wanted something to see and wanted something with them, but you have the proper way of seeing. You have the king, the creator here. This is Yahweh, the one of relationship, that said, if you do these things, I'll be with you. But he cannot be made into an idol. He cannot be made into something in man's image. But if you make a tent,
or controlled.
you can't conjure, because he will come into your midst.
And when we say man's image, we don't mean a portrait of man. We mean in the image that man conceives.
Yeah.
And that goes back to the conjuring thing, is that the problem with that conjuring attitude is you have a conception of what you think God should do, which is not different from saying you have an image of what God should be. Like there's really that's a very fine line to walk.
Because you're not going to make an idol.
Right.
You're not going to make a calf. You're going to make a tent.
And
And he's going to come down from the mountain.
Yeah.
And he's going to dwell in that tent.
Right.
I think one of the most important questions that I could end with my statements are, have we really been made in the image of God, or have we reimagined him in ours?
Yeah, well, I think that's the question for every believer, and every generation has to answer that. So I think it's a pretty good place to wrap that up. Before we close out our episode, I was going to do this in the first episode. I kind of forgot. No big deal. Throughout this semester, for people that are wondering, we're going through the Godhead for 16 weeks and doing nothing but the Godhead for 16 weeks to give a very thorough treatment that it deserves. However, we have broken this up, so I want to give the listeners just a sneak peek at what we're going to be talking about, because it's very, very likely we're going to cover something that you want to hear. There's very likely we're going to cover something, a question, a thought. So throughout the first episode, we covered the kingship of God in Genesis. Today was Exodus. Our next installment is the Davidic covenant. You're talking about the kings, the question about that, and then the fourth installment will be the prophets. Fifth installment, we're going to move into the New Testament. We'll have John. We'll have a focus passage in John, but we're really talking about the Gospels. Installment 6 will be Pauline epistles. 7 will be Hebrews. 8 will be the book of Revelation, and all of these in reference to the Godhead. When we get to installment 9, we're going to cross over a little bit into church history, talking about the Godhead. It's going to be early departures from biblical doctrines. We're going to cover Nicaea. We're going to cover oneness thinkers through history, different attitudes towards oneness theology, both in antiquity and now. And then in the last 4 installments, we're going to cover more in the realm of like oneness theology. So we're going to talk about hot button issues that people come up with a lot. The concept of a theophany, Father and Son language in the New Testament, Adamic Christology. And we did, and one as well, supposed Trinitarian texts and rebuttals. So we will have some, not Q&A as much as answering things that have, answering common issues, exactly. And so all that's going to come up. And if you are a listener, we will have Brother Fry include a contact of some kind in the comment section down
Jeremiah's
below.
cell phone number, so you can
probably
text him
probably not a
personally.
private number, but a place that you can email if you have questions for the show or things that you want covered, something that maybe we can work into one of the episodes. We're not going to do just a straight Q&A, because of course that would not only take a lot of time but take away from what we're doing. But if we can weave it into our lessons, we'll certainly do that. So. With that, I think that concludes our installment on Exodus. So thank you so much to all of our listeners out there, and we will see you back here for our third installment on the kingship of God through the Davidic covenant.